Welcome to You and Your Democracy. It's a short take civics lesson as part of our program, Where Do We Go From Here? I'm Chuck Parkinson. Each episode, we will look at the head and heart of democracy. We will explore the values and the principles that have created our American exceptionalism and examine the structures and institutions that give us the guardrails of our democratic republic. To quote Benjamin Franklin when asked in 1787 after the Constitutional Convention, "Doctor, what have we got, a republic or monarchy?" To which Franklin responded with a rejoinder at once witty and ominous, "A republic if you can keep it." So now let's take a look at what is this great American experiment, and then ask, what do we need to do to keep it? The very essence of democracy requires citizens to participate. We have all heard someone say, "My vote doesn't count," or "It won't matter anyway, so why should I bother?" In today's episode, we will take another look at Does Your Vote Count? I'm pleased to welcome back Short Take's good friend, Dr. John Van Benthuysen, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Black Hills State University. Thanks for being with us today again, John. Does our vote count?
In short, I think the answer is yes, provided, of course, if you use it. Voting is the foundation of any democracy. It's what allows Americans to engage in the long, hard work of forming a more perfect union. It also makes it possible to hold our elected representatives and those with positions of power accountable, both for their actions and their inactions. In short, voting is what distinguishes a citizen from a subject.
It is, and it goes back to the fact that participation makes the democracy work. It reminded me, when I did research a while back, I came upon a quote that's rather interesting from Abraham Lincoln. "Elections belong to the people. It's their decision. If they decide to turn their back on the fire and burn their behinds, then they will just have to sit on their blisters." I found that kind of, I don't know that was one of Lincoln's more quotable quotes that exist, but it certainly is one that I chuckled at when I read it the first time. As we near the election, and voting has started within some time ago, almost a month ago in South Dakota and several other states, and it appears more and more people are taking advantage of the voting system. To address that issue, where, as I said in our opening, that my vote doesn't matter. You touched on that a little bit, but could we go a little more in depth in that? And why should I care to participate?
It's a good question, and I think it's one that a lot of Americans wrestle with. Their democracy asks a lot of its citizens, unlike other forms of government. And one of the things that it asks of its citizens is to be engaged and to participate. And voting is one of those kind of key entry points into participating in the democratic process. But I think it's critical for Americans to realize that the right to vote was not given. It required men and women of all ages and all backgrounds to organize, to protest, and to fight for their right to vote. So I think many Americans would be surprised that early on, the U.S. Constitution didn't originally define who could vote, was and really remains a hotly contested issue for today. And I think the struggle to expand voting has played out over multiple generations, and it continues. And so I think this historical evidence of various groups in American society fighting, organizing, protesting to vote shows that they believed that it was worth having that right, that it was important, that it allowed us again to kind of make progress on making a more perfect union.
Yeah, I think that's important. People forget what a long, hard fight it was for women's suffrage, what a long, hard fight it was for Native Americans. In fact, 1920 for women, the Native Americans got the vote in 1924, but a number of states, including South Dakota, did not allow full voting privileges to our Native American fellow citizens until 1952. There was still a statute on the state laws that required separate things, almost like poll taxes that existed in where I always talk about in the South. And of course, the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which opened up and hopefully to a degree, but voter suppression still occurs, and the fight continues on, which makes that important in my mind. Why your vote is that much more important. One of the things people always say is, well, what if my guy loses or my woman loses? I'm voting for. Why should you vote if they're going to lose?
Because there's always the chance to win the next election. And that's kind of the hallmarks of a democratic system, is that the opposition lives to fight another day. And that's what kind of keeps, everyone has a stake in the system. Even if you haven't had your preferred candidate win this election, there's the future prospect of the following election that kind of gives you hope and keeps you engaged in the system. Democracy doesn't work if you kind of rigidly adhere to this idea that, well, if my preferred candidate doesn't win this election, I'm done and I'm going to take myself out of the system. It really does rely on people to stay involved, even if they think they're not getting exactly what they want at the moment in time.
Yeah, there never is a perfect candidate, and it's that particular candidate may never reach some of the goals that you have, but it is, unfortunately, we've gotten to the us versus them in the world today, and in the United States, where the partisan divide is so deep, and yet there are divisions within both major political parties in the country. And I think we've seen over the years where it used to be voter participation. I use the example again of South Dakota in the 70s and 80s. South Dakota always had 80%, near 80% turnout for voters. And in the last election, we were extremely excited because we had 62% of the voters in South Dakota vote in the presidential election. And you had a lot of disgruntled people that evidently, number one, didn't have time or didn't care to participate, but yet chose to sit it out. And there have been those to say, if you don't vote, you don't have any right to complain.
That is one perspective. I would disagree with that, because I think it's important to realize that there are some substantial formal obstacles to voting in the United States that don't exist in other democratic countries. And so, for example, when everyone votes this November, it's going to be on a Tuesday. And that's potentially problematic because that's a work day, and Americans are hardworking. They're raising families. They're going to school, and that's sometimes difficult to make time during the middle of the work week to actually get out and vote. It's common in other democracies to have a voting holiday, so that there's no kind of tension between work, family obligations of that sort. We also have a history of felony disenfranchisement in this country, which, if you are convicted of a felony, whether it's violent or not, in some states you are permanently stripped of your right to vote. And so that affects a little more than 2 million Americans of voting age in this country. So it's not an insubstantial number of people. And so it's these kind of obstacles that we don't, I think, always think of as obstacles that are serving to depress, at least in some respect, the the number of people who are willing and able to go out to vote.
And that's important. About we did provide the vote to the 18-year-olds in
1971.
1971, and to that particular fact, I use myself as an example. Just by the quirk of the calendar, I didn't cast my first vote until I was 23 years old. I'd already been in the Army for over a year and a half, and that was a real privilege for me. I have not missed an election since, no matter what happens from that standpoint. And I encourage, and I know you do too, to encourage all young people to get involved, because their voice is important.
I couldn't agree more. And 1971, the passage of the 26th Amendment, which you referred to, which lowered the voting age to 18, that represents kind of the high watermark in American voting expansion. And we really haven't seen a lot of effort to kind of expand the scope of voting beyond that, or since 1971. Interestingly, I've heard, and increasingly I'm hearing, arguments in favor of lowering the voting age even more, down to 16. which would get, high school students involved in the voting process. And I must admit that I was pretty skeptical of this idea at first because we all kind of have these stereotypical, ideas about teenagers and irresponsibility. And we were all teenagers at one point and probably engaged in some of that activity ourselves. But again, democracy doesn't take care of itself. It really requires that you have an informed, engaged citizenry, and we need to model democracy at a much earlier age than we have. We kind of have this expectation that citizens will just figure it out on their own, and many do, but not everyone. And so I think there is, increasingly justifications for taking a hard look at expanding voting rights even more to include people as young as 16 to kind of demonstrate and model voting at that young age to hook them while they're young, so to speak.
Exactly. That's a great line. Hook them when they're young and get them involved, and to provide them the educational materials they need in the schools, I think also is very important. Well, short takes are short takes. Final thoughts?
Well, I like to think of someone who's really involved in civic engagement and civic education, Eric Liu, I'd like to quote. He said that there is no such thing as not voting. Not voting is voting for everything that you may oppose. It's voting for the status quo. And what I think he means by this is that power is not static. In a democracy, if you are not acting by doing things like voting, you are being acted upon by others who are taking their voting rights seriously. And so, from that perspective, it really kind of highlights what's at stake. It's your voice. And just because you're not voting doesn't mean that you're not acting or approving of the status quo.
That's a very good thought to finish on. I hope you will join us again as we proceed with these short takes. That's our episode for now. I want to thank John Van Benthuysen for sharing his expertise and thoughts with us today. And as always, our executive producer, Suzanne Stratford, and the SDPB technical staff for their creativity and hard work on this program. Thank you also to the supporters of South Dakota Public Broadcasting who make this program possible. To view previous episodes in this series, go to sdpb.org/yourdemocracy. If you have comments or suggestions for future episodes, send us a note at programming@sdpb.org. Until our next short take, I'm Chuck Parkinson.